Probably one of the least interesting pieces of dive gear for some divers, but there are a lot of interesting designs when it comes to tank valves themselves for different uses, and I'm going to delve into what each particular valve is intended for and what's kind of special about it. Hi all of you awesome scuba divers out there, welcome to the Scuba Diving Magazine channel and your favourite place for the latest scuba diving news and gear reviews. Today's video is sponsored by Scuba.com, but more about them in a little bit. Yeah, we couldn't do very much without a tank valve because, of course, we need a way to keep all of that pressure inside of the cylinder when we're not using it, and we need an easy way to open and close that valve. However, we also use cylinders in a range of ways, more than just strapping a single cylinder onto our back and jumping into the water. We use cylinders in like weird and wonderful ways. So there are more than one or two designs that I'm going to break down in this video, as well as a few handy tips on how to look after your valves and your cylinders in general. Scuba.com is your one-stop shop for everything underwater. Whether you're a seasoned scuba diving pro or just starting to explore the wonders of the deep, Scuba.com has everything that you need. Browse their extensive selection of scuba and snorkeling equipment from leading brands. Find masks, fins, BCDs, wetsuits and regulators and everything else that you need for a comfortable and safe dive. Scuba.com's team consists of highly trained and experienced professionals who have dived all over the world. Get personalized recommendations for the perfect gear, no matter your diving destination or style. Ready to take the plunge? Scuba.com offers scuba diving classes from all levels, from beginner open water diver certification to advanced technical diving courses. If you're looking for the ultimate underwater adventure, Scuba.com curates diving trips around the globe to exotic destinations. Dive into a world of possibilities with Scuba.com. The first thing that you need to be aware of is that the threads that screw in that valve into the cylinder itself, they vary. There's more than one screw thread, and it is essential that the threads on the cylinder and the valve match, and they don't just screw together, because some that can screw together don't match. It's complicated, but basically you have to make sure that they match precisely. There are some male and female threads that do screw together and they feel correct. However, they actually fail once pressurized, which is obviously dangerous. It is essential that the threads match and they're stamped into both the cylinder and the valve during manufacturing, so you can check, you can cross-reference and make sure that they are made for one another. The most common in the dive industry is M25x2, which is a parallel thread. You can sometimes find a smaller M18x1.5 and a 3/4 BSP, and the 3/4 is the one that's quite similar to the M25. They can go together, but not properly. There's a variety of others, obviously, depending on where you are in the world, which is why it's essential to use the correct thread. It'll vary on like cylinder size and all sorts of different things, but those are the most common ones. You can also find sometimes some tapered threads, which are less common in my experience, but needless to say, if it doesn't match, don't try and pressurize the cylinder. And if you're ever unsure, just ask your technician at your dive center. If you need a replacement valve, if you're unsure, just bring it into your local test center and they'll go, you need one of these. For the regulator itself, the connection, we've settled on a few standard connections for regulators. The first one that I'll get out of the way quickly that you might come across as a scuba diver is a pin index valve, which looks like this. It's typically only used on oxygen valves for surface use. So if you're doing like your rescue course or something, you may come across one of these. They've got 3 holes in them, 2 holes which are side by side, therefore locator pins on the actual regulator itself. You have 2 metal pins and they line up. You need a special regulator to attach onto this valve. It's not something that you can attach a normal dive regulator to. And then of course the 3rd hole is the outlet for the oxygen. The first scuba diving connection it's got various names, from Yoke to A-clamp or international fitting. You may see it as like INT or something, A-clamp, Yoke, int. It's got lots of different names. Personally, I call it A-clamp. You can recognize these because you can see the O-ring in the valve itself, and the face of the valve is quite flat. You'll often have like an indentation, but it's quite flat compared to some of the others. If it looks like this, then you can only attach an A-clamp regulator to it. Some A-clamp valves that you come across will have a hex in the middle like this that you can unscrew and remove a small adapter that I call a donut. It's a round thing and it's got a hole in the middle, so of course it's a donut. The donut will have O-rings on both sides, and it allows you to use an A-clamp regulator on a DIN valve. A DIN valve will just have a female screw thread into it, so you can see how it's very non-flat compared to an A-clamp valve. And on a DIN valve, you won't see an O-ring. The O-ring's on your regulator, and you screw that part, the DIN part, into the valve itself, so the O-ring is trapped on the inside. There are several variations of DIN valve. You'll find a 232 bar, which has 5 threads, and a 300 bar version, which is a bit longer, that has 7 threads. And all that is to prevent you fitting a 200 bar regulator to a 300 bar cylinder. Most DIN regulators today are 300 bar DIN, and they'll have all of those 7 threads. You can confirm that by looking at the DIN fitting itself. It will have 300 bar or sometimes 200 bar, like stamped or laser etched onto it somewhere. But a 300 bar DIN regulator can fit into both a 232 valve and a 300 bar DIN valve because they're both the same G5/8 threads. It's just one will have a few more exposed threads if you're trying to get a 300 into a 232. It's just the alternative. So you can't put a 200 bar into a 300 because it's literally not long enough. It'll go in and it'll stop, but then as soon as you try and pressurize it, it will just hiss and make a lot of noise. There also exists a M26 DIN, which is used in certain regions for Nitrox. It's a bit bigger than the G5/8s, and in a similar way, it prevents you from using non-Nitrox regulators on a Nitrox cylinder. The most standard valve design is often called a K valve. And I believe that's due to the original like diving parts catalog listings. It just had the valve and a whole bunch of other parts and pieces, and it just happened to be the letter K. So divers would look at the catalog, they'd call up and say, I would like a K valve, please. You'll have a knob on one side and an outlet rather straight upwards from the cylinder. Sometimes it's kind of off to one side. It depends on the design. But yeah, the most basic like valve design we often call a K valve. You don't see these very much anymore, but the naming follows the previous design, and you sometimes hear about them in conversation. If you see a toggle on one side of the valve, usually opposite from the actual hand wheel, different to the hand wheel opens and closes the valve, but the separate mechanism was intended to reserve a certain pressure of gas so that when you're getting low on gas, a spring would close the airflow and you'd feel that. You'd know that you were down to about 500 psi, depending on the strength of the spring. You would then toggle the switch, or you'd like pull on a rod that went down the length of the cylinder that just pulled that toggle down, and that would release the reserve gas, and you get that like final 500 psi as long as you set it up correctly at the start of the dive. It was all because submersible pressure gauges didn't really exist back then, or they were quite hard to find when recreational diving began, but you won't see too many of these in active use today, but named J valve because it was like the next design below the K valve. You'd call up in the catalogue, oh yeah, I'd like a J valve because it was a reserve valve. Here we start to move away from the like catalogue naming of valves after letters and more towards the actual shape of the valve and dual outlets also. A H valve has 2 outlets so that you can connect 2 regulators to a single cylinder. If you think about failure points, you have 2 second stages when you dive. One for you, one for your buddy, just in case something fails, but you yourself only dive a single first stage. And if that single first stage fails, you're in trouble. Also, if you're diving in colder waters and your buddy needs to use your alternate, then you're both breathing through second stages, but all that gas is running through, effectively doubling the airflow running through that first stage, which increases the chances of it freezing. So divers in colder climates, diving single cylinders, wanted 2 outlets so that you could fit a second stage to each separate first stage for extra redundancy. Sometimes they'll be fixed like this valve, but you can also find an add-on valve that you can fit to a different type of valve, which is called a manifold, that I'll talk about in a second. Similar to the H valve, it's named for its shape and its design, being a dual outlet valve. A Y valve has those 2 outlets at like more of an angle as opposed to a H valve, which may give you better spacing for your regulators and your hoses and things. They also have an offshoot that I just know as a slingshot, which is just an unsymmetrical Y valve. It just has the 2 outlets just a bit further apart basically. But yeah, this is a Y valve, but very, very similar to a H valve. If you're diving twin cylinders, then you have the option to connect them through a manifold. This part in the middle is called the manifold. They can have an isolator valve like this one in the middle, but you can find some just bare ones which are just simple bars. They're quite rare, but most tend to have like isolator valves nowadays. The valves either side are similar to the basic K valve, but they have a side feed which can be blocked off with a blank, or you can screw the manifold into. And they're mirror images of one another. And because of that, we have a left-handed screw thread on one so that you can screw the manifold into both of them like simultaneously without having to flip one cylinder around and around to actually screw it in. Modular valves are obviously popular for twin sets, but because you can blank them and they have this protrusion coming out of the side, they can be popular with side mount divers as well. The side outlet adds just a better like shoulder point, which is really strong to hold the cylinder in place. And the left and right handed valves can go on either side of you when you're side mount diving, so that your hand wheels are always pointing in the right way as opposed to opposites. And you can find some nowadays, because side mount divers were buying these modular valves because of that little sort of thing sticking out of the side. Some have actually gone, you know what, if you're not going to use that that actual outlet, we may as well just build a valve with a little sort of section of metal sticking out. Gives you the benefits of that side mount without having the extra like machining. Some features that you may notice on some valves have what's called a burst disc. It's a sacrificial overpressure relief valve that's kind of built into the valve itself that will burst before the cylinder itself bursts if the internal pressure gets too high. It's usually a small metal disc that will burst close to the test pressure. I think I read somewhere between 85 to 100% of the test pressure of the cylinder itself. So that is going to burst instead of the complete cylinder. It's rare for them to fail under normal working pressure, and some areas do require them as a standard. You'll need to look up local regulations where you are as to whether you do or do not need a valve with a burst disc. But yeah, if you read about burst discs, it's something that's designed to fail before the cylinder does, so it vents off excess gas and it doesn't damage the cylinder. You just replace the burst disc if you need to. Some valves, you'll notice a neat little hole that drilled into one side, which seems like a silly place to put a hole, but it helps to release any buildup of pressure between your valve and the regulator that's screwed into it that may prevent you from removing the regulator. Sometimes, either like at the end of the dive, when you close the cylinder valve, you depressurize your regulator, there's still a small amount of pressure in that small area between the valve seat inside of the actual valve itself and threads of your regulator, pushing the regulator outwards, and that can make it too tight to remove your regulator. And it's just on the outside of that O-ring seal, so as long as your regulator is fitted correctly, you won't see like any gas leaking from that hole unless you're physically trying to remove it. It's supposed to be there. It's not a fault. Don't worry about it. If there is a lot of gas leaking out of there, chances are you need to replace your O-ring. Most new divers feel like they need to wrench the valve closed to hold the pressure back when they're like closing a cylinder, which has the unfortunate effect of actually damaging the sealing surface inside of the valve, which makes it harder to close the valve next time. You only need to close it finger tight. If any gas continues to leak after you've closed it finger tight, then you simply need to service that valve. The metal that valves are made from is usually chrome-plated brass, which is quite soft. And whilst people generally don't intend to drop cylinders, if it does fall on the valve, it can disfigure very easily, requiring a replacement valve. Sometimes you'll go to like fit a DIN regulator and it just really doesn't go. It can just be because it's been squashed just a tiny bit from a fall or something. Your eyes might not notice it, but the precision of the actual thread going into it will notice. So if there is any kind of like awkwardness or like it's hard to get the actual DIN in, obviously make sure that it's not being cross-threaded. So it's going in nice and straight, but also if you've been trying for a long time and you know that you're doing it correctly, it may just need a replacement valve because yeah, the metal is quite soft, and do not try and bend it back. If you're worried about your valves, like bending or breaking or something, you can fit cages that attach around the neck of the cylinder, and it just has a metal cage that protects your regulators and the valves from bumps. You see them quite a lot if you invert your cylinders so that they're valved downwards. Cages are fairly common, so you can stand the cylinder upright without standing it on top of the valve and on top of your regulators. You can also damage the valve itself by carrying it incorrectly. New divers often see that hand wheel and think, that's a carry handle. Unfortunately, if you put all of the weight of the cylinder on that hand wheel by lifting it just by the hand wheel itself, you can damage some of the parts inside. So if you can, then a carry handle is a great addition to a cylinder. It attaches around the neck. I prefer the rigid ones, the big chunky ones, because the thinner ones often bend when you pick them up, especially heavier steel cylinders, and some can even pinch your hand and it is just uncomfortable, so I just go for the chunkier ones. Without a handle, try to hold the cylinder as close to the neck as possible and hold the weight by the body of the cylinder, if you can, obviously. If you're trying to carry two, it's quite hard to do that. But yeah, try and keep your hand on the other side of the outlet when you're holding onto the actual valve, so that you don't get a blast of compressed air into your skin if the valve suddenly opens. But yeah, try not to hold the cylinder by the actual valve wheel because you can damage it. Dust caps are nice, but do be careful with them, especially metal ones. Dust caps are great to keep the dust out of the inlet of the valve, but a quick blast of gas will do that anyway. One thing they can do though is trap moisture in the inlet, as well as other contaminants, because yeah, you're literally just covering it over. The screw-in ones, they are good to keep dust out, but do be sure that they don't seal inside of that valve, because if you accidentally turn the hand wheel, it can pressure lock it in place. Some may have a mechanism to prevent this, but if it doesn't, then you may need to drill it out. And when you make two different metals touch for extended periods, they can fuse together, either because one metal expands or contracts more from temperature changes than the other, or something called cold welding can literally fuse two different metals together. So if you have a metal plug, just take them out every now and then, give them a clean, and then put them back in, and try to make sure they're not in very tight. We're just there to prevent like dust and stuff from getting inside, so don't worry too much about being like wrenched in tight. The hex key in a donut, it's usually an 8mm. That's the most common size and what most hex keys that are made for diving are. There are some smaller ones out there, like 5.5mm I think I've come across, but most that I've come across are a standard 8mm. If you see a gauge on a valve like this one, it may be for surface use only. A lot of like air rifle users will have a separate cylinder that they can top their guns up with, which have a special valve in it with a built-in gauge, so they know how much is in the cylinder. But those gauges themselves, they're not always submersible, so don't take them diving. And also, you don't need to blow out your regulator and your dust cap after a dive with gas from your cylinder. It's just loud and annoying for everyone to be around you, and it can actually spray water into your first stage, which is exactly what you're trying to prevent, so just use a towel. And I think that's it for now. If you dig hard enough, you can find more like screw thread sizes and obscure valve designs, but those really are the most common ones that you'll see today. Tank valves are one of those parts where you can technically go for the cheapest option and it should work perfectly fine, or you can go for the fanciest valve designs. That's truly a nice experience, but it's still just a tank valve. Where you sit on that spectrum is really up to you, but think about other valve designs out there that may be better suited for your needs or easier to service. Some are quite tall, which if you think about where the cylinder's positioned behind you, it may clonk you on the back of the head, or you may need something a bit longer that you can actually reach. Some are a bit shorter for the opposite reasons, and some have valves coming out of the top, the side, the back, you name it. You'll be able to find anything if you look hard enough. So you do have if you do have a specific need, then yeah, just have a good hunt around. You'll probably find it. If you have any questions about them, then ask away down in the comment section, or ask our good friends over at scuba.com. I'll pop links up in the corner and down in the description as well, so you can check them out. And remember to like and subscribe to our channel here on YouTube for more scuba diving content. We've got some exciting equipment videos coming up. Thank you for watching, everybody, and of course, safe diving.